In the summer of 2025, a relationship that was supposed to be a cornerstone of global stability it completely fractured. The United States and India, two of the world's biggest democracies, suddenly found themselves in a massive diplomatic and trade crisis. So let's get into it. How did this critical partnership go sour so fast?
It really all kicked off with this one number, 50%. In August of 2025, the US government, pretty much out of the blue, slapped a staggering 50% tariff on almost all Indian imports. That is one of the highest duties ever placed on a major trading partner.
And the reason why? Well, it came straight from the top. President Trump's declaration here really says it all. It captures that confrontational tone that just lit the fuse on this trade war. Suddenly, India wasn't being framed as a partner, but as an economic rival. Which, brings us to the big question we're tackling in this explainer. How on earth did a partnership, one that was built up over decades by both parties, unravel so spectacularly? To really get the breakdown, we first have to understand what was on the line. You see, right before this crisis, the US-India relationship was hitting a historic high. Seriously, let's do a quick rewind and see just how strong this bond had become.
For years, this partnership was just hitting one milestone after another. That 2008 civil nuclear deal, a total game changer, and it just kept getting better. Fast forward to early 2025, and both countries were aiming for $500 billion in trade. It really was a partnership honeymoon.
And look, this was about so much more than just trade and defense deals. We're talking about a comprehensive global strategic partnership. It was driven by shared democratic values and, let's be honest, a shared interest in keeping the Indo-Pacific stable and open, which was really seen as a way to counterbalance China's growing power. But there was always this underlying tension, and it was rooted in a core idea of India's foreign policy.
And that idea is strategic autonomy. What does that mean? Well, essentially, India has always insisted on having the freedom to make its own calls. It's about balancing its relationships with everyone, the US, Russia, China, without getting locked into one single camp. And that refusal to be tied down, that is absolutely key to understanding the friction that was about to explode.
So the first real shots in this whole crisis were definitely fired on the economic front. But the truth is, these arguments had been simmering under the surface for years.
At the heart of it, you had two totally different stories. The US administration was looking at a massive trade deficit and calling India the tariff king. Meanwhile, India was looking at these new US tariffs and calling them punitive, unfair, and just unreasonable, arguing that their own tariffs were necessary for a developing economy.
And this disagreement just escalated incredibly fast. On August 1st, boom, a 25% tariff. Then, less than a month later, another 25% gets tacked on top. And this time, it was explicitly linked to India buying oil from Russia. The result? A jaw-dropping 50% combined duty that sent shockwaves through the global economy.
And from there, the conflict just spiraled. It went way beyond a simple trade deficit. Suddenly, there were all these flashpoints. Everything from India's oil imports from Russia, which Delhi called a national compulsion, to its involvement in groups like BRICS. And pretty soon, you had both sides accusing each other of hypocrisy.
Now, as explosive as all the economic stuff was, it was really being fueled by something deeper. This was a complex geopolitical game where big policies and even bigger personalities were colliding.
You just have to look at a map to understand India's position. It sits in a really tough neighborhood, right next to Pakistan and China. That geography forces it to perform this incredibly delicate balancing act. This whole multi-alignment thing means it just can't afford to push away Russia, which has been its defense supplier for ages, while it also needs the West to help balance out China.
So here's a crucial point, at least according to analysts at Jefferies Group. The crisis wasn't just about geopolitics, it was also personal. What this quote is saying is that those crazy high tariffs were driven by President Trump's own frustration after India publicly shot down his claim that he could mediate the conflict with Pakistan.
And what added fuel to that fire was what many saw as a diplomatic snub. In June 2025, just 2 months before the tariffs hit, Prime Minister Modi turned down a dinner invite from President Trump. He cited commitments back home, but in the world of high-stakes diplomacy, gestures like that can have some pretty major consequences.
So you can imagine, the fallout from this meltdown was immediate and it was widespread. It sent ripples across the entire globe.
The economic hit was just brutal. All of a sudden, 70% of India's exports to its biggest market were under threat.
Big plans for U.S. companies to shift their supply chains to India stalled. And, maybe most critically, India reportedly hit the brakes on over $3 billion in U.S. defense deals.
And the pain wasn't just coming from tariffs. Nope. Another lever of U.S. policy, the H-1B visa, which is absolutely vital for India's massive IT sector, was also being squeezed. As you can see, when those approval rates dropped, the costs for Indian IT firms just skyrocketed. It was another layer of economic pressure.
Experts who watch this stuff for a living were just stunned. Michael Kugelman at the Wilson Center, someone who's followed this relationship forever, he didn't pull any punches. He called it flat out the worst crisis in 2 decades.
Well, this created a huge geopolitical opening. And guess who stepped right in? China. America's #1 strategic rival seized the moment. Their ambassador to India came out and publicly slammed the U.S. tariffs, basically positioning Beijing as a friend to New Delhi.
Now, back in the U.S., plenty of people were sounding the alarm. Nikki Haley warned that pushing away India, the single best counterbalance to China in Asia, wasn't just a mistake, it was a strategic disaster. It was undoing decades of careful diplomatic work.
Okay, so after all that damage, where does this incredibly important relationship even go from here? What are the big takeaways from this whole unprecedented meltdown?
All right, let's boil it all down. This whole crisis was really a perfect storm of economic friction, geopolitical pressure, and personal politics. It put decades of hard work at risk, cast a real shadow over important alliances like the Quad, and frankly, it forced countries all over the world to ask themselves if they can truly rely on U.S. partnerships.
Which leaves us all with the ultimate question, doesn't it? Is this just a temporary fallout between 2 leaders, something that can be fixed? Or are we actually watching the beginning of a permanent shift in the global order? Only time is going to tell.